Hey everyone, I know I've done a little bit of patch content recently, but today I want to go over the parameter changes since we got them, and I'm recording this a bit ahead of time because I'm going to be just taking a break for a few days. But I just wanted to make sure I got this recorded in advance this time, and I feel like I have enough information to talk about it anyway, so we have the exact parameter data. I've gotten to test the changes. I've talked with a few other players about it, so I want to give just a brief summary of what I think has actually changed and be a bit more specific with it. So let's get into detail. So first up is the paintbrush change, which is a 2-frame faster fire rate, pretty much what we thought it was going to be from the initial notes. I think that this most notably increases the paint slightly and helps with the kill time, particularly if it is a 3-shot, since that is 4 frames faster. However, paintbrush's overall limited speed and lack of huge paint options, I think, limits things a little too much. You don't have enough to play for the missile or to get good supportive paint, especially with Sensor as a non-lethal sub, and the first weapon kit that Paintbrush has with the Curling Wavebreaker unfortunately just doesn't have as valuable a special to play toward. That's not to say that this buff isn't impactful. I think that Paintbrush is still okay with Tenebrella. That's mainly where we would see it, but I don't think it's enough to really change its status very much. I don't think we'll be seeing anyone in top level using it currently. Next up is Pencil. Like I thought, this is about a 5% paint nerf for about 1 point per shot, just like last time, in addition to 220p. I think this is enough to force Pencil to run a little bit more charge up than it did before and have a little bit less gear freedom. For the most part, this helps accelerate. That Edit is the better, cooler option compared to Pencil. However, I still think that Pen will remain a top 5 weapon. I still think it will be basically even with Edit, and I think that we're not going to see too many changes to the comps using it. Which, while that might not sound like a good thing, I think it is. I think the Pencil has been rather healthy right now. I haven't had big complaints with it. And I think with the addition of these nerfs, it's going to be in just about the right spot. Next up are the Dooley's Collision hitbox. A lot of people were talking about if this was reverting a nerf from Splatoon 2, and the answer is partially. In Splatoon 2, at one point, this number was 0.25. So it seems like they're reaching a bit of a middle ground between where it is now and where it was before. I think this allows it to be a little bit more consistent, and from what I've heard, Dooley players have been enjoying it, but it doesn't seem like it's the most major change out of anything. Dooley is already in a pretty decent spot right now, especially as it gets picked for the support option, so I think this will help it see more use in that area, but I don't think it's going to change too much. Dapple Doolies, on the other hand, I think are a little bit more scary. I've held the opinion for a while that I think Dapple Doolies are a very underrated weapon that should be getting a lot more discussion around it, and I think this buff will probably be the thing to push it over the edge. It's a very small change, all things considered, but it is to its weakest area in terms of its overall range. I don't think it's going to make it like a top 10 weapon or anything, but I do think it'll help cement it as a valuable weapon to be able to pick in the right situations. It's also worth noting that it looks like the jump RNG is slightly decreased due to the shot velocity changes, which is pretty cool, including some of the grounded RNG over here, since there's some parameter data for that. Next up is the Big Swig Roller. So it turns out that the increase to this actually is still slightly smaller than other rollers. For example, I asked where Rollers was, and Roller's collision hitbox is 7/0.75, whereas Big Swigs now went from 0.6 to 0.65 to 0.65 to 0.7. So this means that Swigs is closer to Rollers, however it seems like they've kept its weakness as having the harshest hitbox out of all of them. I think that this still helps a little bit, but Big Swig is just so far from seeing competitive use that I don't think it's going to do too much until a special weapon is changed. Next up is Decav. I think the paint nerf is noticeable, but not as much as I thought, and same for the Dash startup. Overall, I actually don't think Decav has really changed that much. It's definitely going to keep it from being the highest tier of weapon, but I think that was already where it was trending to currently. I think the Decav players may consider a little more main saver or charge up to help with bubble output, but for the most part, I don't think the weapon actually changes that much. It's definitely weaker, but there's just not really a whole lot of competition for it, and despite other bubble weapons being buffed, I think this is still very clearly the best one alongside Roller. On to one that did surprise us. We knew that Recycle Paint was getting slightly buffed, but slightly was a bit of an understatement. You could see that the shot width went from 1.57 to 2.0, which is an increase of about 27%, which is pretty ridiculous. On top of that, it also got an additional 2 shots, going from 14 to 16 shots. Now, I do still think Recycle Shield is unfortunately just way too weak to work. However, the vanilla Recycle does have a bubble as a way to make up for that weakness, and the amount of bubbles you're able to get now compared to previously is a lot higher. So I do think that Recycle has gone from a bottom tier, low tier weapon to maybe the high end of low tier, at absolute best middle of the road B or C tier type weapon to me. The weapon's power is still good enough to find a decent amount of kills with its shot spread. The shield still does paint a good amount, which helps with the bubbles, and getting a lot of bubble is still very useful. There's definitely better options. You basically have the sub-weapon that's nearly useless, and the shield is still very easy to shred. But I do think the weapon has a little bit more of a game plan, since now it actually has flexibility to play around a powerful special. Next up is Aerospray. I think that Aerospray is a very annoying, very spammy weapon right now. Like with the other changes, it looks like the jump RNG and RNG in general was reduced a bit. Same for all of those that got the 3% change. But for the most part, I think that Aerospray as a main weapon is still very lacking. And while its kits are on some of the more powerful side, I still don't think they're at the point where you would really want to run the weapon. I think Gold Aerospray is unfortunately still outclassed by Neosplash, and it doesn't really help it that Neosplash just has the special that counters Gold Arrows. And I think in terms of Reef Slider, Aerospray really still lacks the combat capabilities to play off of it properly in a hybrid way, in a similar way that something like Dread can. Because of this, I think that Aerospray is still largely outclassed by other similar options, even though it's been a lot better. As for Splattershot Jr., I think that Junior's RNG is unfortunately so extreme that this range buff isn't too noticeable outside of the extra paint, which means that it will be getting bubbles a little bit faster and having a bit stronger paint output. But in terms of Junior's issues with being able to fight a little bit better in this meta, I don't think it actually helps that much, and I haven't really been able to notice much of a substantial difference. Definitely still better, but I don't think it's going to change the problems that are already mitigating it from seeing use. Nova's jump RNG is somewhat significant, but this is the weapon in the weakest spot right now. The problem is really that its ground RNG is also completely horrible, so even though its jump RNG is a lot better, it's still just a way too high value because of the ground RNG. So because that's been so large a problem for the weapon, this doesn't really change too much. I guess you can jump a little bit more if you want to, but you're still largely going to be dealing with the same problem. As for NZAP, I think this was an option that surprised me a little bit. I didn't really notice the RNG changes too much. However, the strafe speed was a notable increase, especially when stacked with Tacticooler. That being said, what I said originally about it still stands, that I think it needs other anchor weapons to be worth picking to see more NZAP. That or maybe 190p would help, but in general, I think there needs to be anchor options. As of right now, the only one that fits the bill of being worth it is E-Leader, as the other options like Rapid Pro Deco or even Custom Expo, if the Splashdown buff helps it, would really just only be a factor with Edit Splatling, since Edit is fine with those and is the strongest cooler option. Overall, I think that other backlines are in a bit of a better spot after this patch, with V-Well being better with its hammer, Custom Expo Splashdown, and Heavy Edit Heavy Splittlings just generally being buffed. I just don't think it's enough, really. I think that these backlines really need stronger specials, and the only one to get that directly addressed is V-Well, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. I think that Sploosh is a little bit more noticeable than the others. It does seem to be a bit better at fighting, and it got a good hammer buff. Like with Recycle, I think this is enough to pull it out of the absolute bottom tier of main weapons. However, I don't think it's going to be like potential to be middle of the road like Vanilla Recycle could, because the special is still on the lower end, and the weapon still has major problems with its range value. I'm going to jump ahead of the Splatlings real quick before I go back down to the other options. I think that Mini's buff still helps it quite a lot. Again, like with how it was before, Mini was very close to seeing used before, and while it does still have similar problems, I think the overall increase in paint time and being able to get kills faster because of the charge time is going to be substantial enough to allow it to see some competitive use. Though for the most part, I don't think it's going to change too much to previously. Heavy Splatling, on the other hand, is a little bit more substantial since the firing time also helps with it, and you can see the exact numbers here. But for the most part, my thoughts on Heavy are that it still needs a good special in order to be worth the anchor slot that it's being picked in. And unfortunately, Wavebreaker is still without buffs. Before I get to the overall conclusion, we have the specials. Splashdown's paint radius is the least impactful one. It's definitely still okay, and paired with the points for special for some weapons definitely helps a little bit. However, I think that this isn't too big a deal. I've seen some discussion on the fact that it can, cap the zone a bit better. However, I don't think it's ever going to pass as a form of zone cheese when it can be shot down. This isn't to say it won't be somewhat helpful at capping zone, but it's just not going to be that big a deal, especially paired with the fact that you have to be on the zone to use it. That said, I think Splashdown is slightly better. Really, the only option I think would be looked at because of this is Custom Explosher, but I don't really expect us to see too much of it, honestly. Next up is Trizuka. with its 53 damage radius, and the exact reduction is going from 4 units to 2.5 units, which is pretty substantial. I believe this is about half a line now instead of about a full line. That is a very drastic decrease. The 35 damage hitbox covers everything that was the old radius. In addition to that, the Zuka duration is reduced by half a second, which is a lot, though I think it's not as noticeable as I thought it would be. Overall, I think Trizuka still is fine as a special. I think that this mainly just hurts V-Shot, and I think in concluding with this patch, V-Shot was absolutely the most hurt top tier in this, since obviously Zuka spam is kind of its thing, and now Zuka spam is much harder and less consistent of a strategy. In terms of Slayer weapons, Zuka being a bit more hit or miss is fine for stuff like Squeezer because it already is kind of hit or miss for that, and the reasons you pick the weapon aren't really around the Zuka. This isn't to say that the change doesn't hurt, but I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. I think that most of the Zuka weapons that are strong enough to be picked would be picked anyway, regardless of the Zuka changes. Again, things like Squeezer or Carbon are picked for the main primarily. That said, I think this is the healthiest change they did. Zuka was very overtuned with its 2-shot radius, and this was a long overdue nerf that should have happened like a year ago. I think the main one that people are going to be talking about is Ultra Stamp. In terms of the bug fix for the rush mode, I haven't really noticed any difference, and I haven't heard anyone else really notice anything either, other than maybe some potential placebo effects. But it doesn't seem like there's anything consistently replicating it being more consistent at blocking for you. So I'm going to talk about this just in terms of the throw. And in terms of the throw mode, I do think that this is better for sure. Like, I do think it is a noticeable increase in the special's power. There is much more times the throw mode will do 60 damage to work off of teammates or find stray kills, and I think it's something you have to respect. However, it's also become very clear that the Zuka and Stamp comparisons are a little bit unfair, mainly for a few reasons. First off, you only have 1 shot instead of 3. Second, the shot velocity. But third, and possibly the most important one, Zuka is very lenient at clipping through and around walls with its multiple different shots and weird curve velocity and just general Zuka programming jank. Stamp, on the other hand, very easily collides with pretty much anything remotely being close to it. This means that the Stamp throw in general is not going to be hitting as close to you when you're playing around cover as something like a Zuka would, which means I think it's actually relatively easy to play around when paired around its other problems. Now, this isn't to say it doesn't help Stamp. I think that it is much more consistent of a game plan, and in places where you're forced to throw it, it does still help, and in particular is nice with Wiper, that has ways of playing off of the 60 damage. But that being said, I think that Stamp actually is going to end up still being a lower end of specials. Just instead of being like a bottom 5 special, I think it'll be like somewhere in the 5th through 10th place. I guess this kind of approaches middle of the road. You'll have some uses of the rush mode, but if you don't, you have a throw mode to potentially get some value, and because of that, there's a bit of a higher chance your Stamp is going to have moderate value, though it still has high risk. Basically, that's all that I think changes, though. Stamp goes from low risk and medium reward to low risk and kind of a high reward. Or sorry, not low risk. I have these backwards. High risk to low reward versus a high risk to a medium reward. There's just a bit more likelihood that you get something out of it. But to be a really good special at this point with this high risk, you have to have a very high reward, and I don't think Stamp has that. Overall, my thoughts on this patch are that I think the top level of weapons aren't going to change too much. Pen is slightly worse, Decap's slightly worse, Squeezer's slightly worse. But for the most part, I think that Shot's the only one that'll drop off, and it hasn't been that common anyway. Outside of that, I don't think there's going to be many buffs that are really going to approach the top level of weapons here. I think that the most likely things to see more use are going to be Wiper and Mini Splatling, and maybe Vanilla Wellstring and Rainmaker if that Stamp buff ends up helping it a little bit more. But for the most part, I think that the very top end of weapons aren't going to change too much. For the most part, this patch really served to help a lot of the lower tier weapons reach more of the middle of the road, which I can understand as a goal, but I think it's a little underwhelming when all is said and done. For the most part, I think that you do want more weapons to be notable, strong weapons, rather than turning weak weapons into just very average ones. That said, if it stacks with other buffs in this game or in the future, I could see it having a better impact long term just from the sheer quantity of them, so that's something for sure. But for the most part, I think that there are some changes that are a bit long overdue. If we want to fix the backline issue to help with Zap, which we seem to care about with how often we've been buffing it, then can we start buffing things like Wavebreaker, please? Like, we've been waiting a bit forever for it. That said, I think that's all my thoughts on this. I hope you guys have enjoyed this little extra breakdown and the exact data. Again, a big shout out to Carrot for providing all of this information in such a clear manner so that I can get a look at the exact information and make sure I'm getting a proper conclusion. Thanks for watching.